One might have imagined, though one would have been mistaken, that the Democratic Party had finally located something resembling a spine during the 40-day government shutdown. After all, the issue at hand was not some arcane parliamentary procedural point, but rather the health insurance premiums of more than 20 million Americans, many of whom face the prospect of doubling or tripling their costs if the Enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies expire. This, one might think, would constitute what the pollsters euphemistically call a winning issue. Public opinion sided with the Democrats. The recent elections in Virginia, New Jersey, and New York had demonstrated that voters were rather more enthusiastic about candidates who promised to protect healthcare than those who offered vague assurances, and Trump's increasingly demented Truth Social ravings about sending money directly to the people. And yet, on Sunday evening, 8 Democratic senators, Dick Durbin of Illinois, Angus King of Maine, Catherine Cortez Masto, and Jackie Rosen of Nevada, John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, Tim Kaine of Virginia, and Jeanne Shaheen and Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, voted to advance a Republican funding measure that offers precisely nothing of substance in exchange for Democratic cooperation. In a 60-40 vote, these 8 joined Republicans to advance the House-passed measure, which had fallen short on 14 previous votes. What they received for their troubles was not a guarantee of health care protections, not a binding commitment, but rather the political equivalent of a gentleman's agreement, a promise of a vote on extending the ACA subsidies sometime before mid-December. Allow me to translate this into plain English. They got nothing. Or rather, they got a promise to discuss getting something at some unspecified future date, with no assurance of success, from a Republican Party that has spent the better part of 15 years attempting to immolate the Affordable Care Act and dance on its ashes. The Democratic senators faced almost instant blowback from members of their own party as they voted to allow the Senate to move forward on compromise legislation that would reopen the government. Bernie Sanders called it a very bad vote. California Governor Gavin Newsom dismissed it as pathetic. Representative Richie Torres of New York characterized it as an unconditional surrender that abandons the 24 million Americans whose healthcare premiums are about to double. One struggles to identify the hyperbole in Torres's assessment. The apologists for this debacle have trotted out the usual litany of excuses. Senator Tim Kaine, representing Virginia and its legion of federal employees, assured his constituents that lawmakers know their constituents expect them to vote for the subsidies, and if they don't, they could be replaced at the ballot box. This is the sort of magical thinking one associates with fortune tellers and astrologers. The notion that Republican senators, having just witnessed their colleagues refuse to budge for 40 days, will suddenly develop a conscience or a fear of electoral consequences, strains credulity past the breaking point. The argument from Senator Angus King and his fellow capitulators is that the shutdown was causing too much suffering. King had been voting since the outset to reopen the government, yet also played a key role in these negotiations. One might have more sympathy for this position if the suffering caused by the shutdown didn't pale in comparison to what will be inflicted when millions lose their health care or see their premiums skyrocket. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program ran out of funds, yes. Air traffic controllers worked without pay, yes. But are these hardships worse than condemning 20 million people to choose between healthcare and rent, between medications and groceries? Here we encounter the fundamental intellectual bankruptcy of the centrist position. These senators would have us believe they are the pragmatists, the adults in the room who understand that politics is the art of the possible. But what they've actually demonstrated is that they are the embodiment of what Lenin is said to have called useful idiots. Though in fairness to Lenin, at least the original useful idiots believed they were advancing a coherent ideology, however monstrous. These 8 democratic defectors can't even claim that distinction. They have managed the remarkable feat of surrendering without securing even the flimsiest of concessions, all while convincing themselves they've struck a masterstroke of political genius. The timing of their collapse makes the surrender even more inexcusable. After almost 6 weeks of a painful shutdown, a critical number of Senate Democrats backed a Republican funding bill to reopen the government, with little to show for holding out so long. They held out for 40 days, endured all that suffering they now cite as justification for surrender, and ended up accepting the very same deal they could have had on day one. The moral obscenity of this capitulation becomes even clearer when one considers what the Democrats were asking for. They were not demanding some radical restructuring of American healthcare, not proposing single-payer or Medicare for all, not even suggesting the United States join the rest of the civilized world in treating healthcare as a human right rather than a commodity. They were merely asking to maintain the status quo, to extend subsidies that already exist and that already benefit millions of Americans. And even this modest request proved too much for their courage to sustain. The idea that promising a vote constitutes a meaningful victory is so transparently risible that only a centrist Democratic senator could advance it with a straight face. The 31-page bill makes no mention of the expiring Obamacare tax credits. Instead, the agreement includes a guarantee from Republican leadership that the Senate will vote on a health care bill drafted by Democrats before the second week of December. A guarantee of a vote from Republicans on health care. One is expected to receive this news with gratitude and relief. The Democratic Party has a long and distinguished history of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, but this episode deserves special recognition. They had everything going for them: public opinion, recent electoral victories, a Republican Party increasingly fractious and desperate to end the shutdown, and an issue, healthcare, that has proven to be a winning one for Democrats time and again. And what did they do with these advantages? They folded like a cheap suit at the first sign of discomfort. Many Democrats are fuming after a breakaway group of 8 senators teamed up with Republicans to strike a deal to reopen the government without extending healthcare subsidies, backing off on the demand that led to the shutdown. Representative Ro Khanna, who is considering a presidential run, called for new party leadership and boldly suggested that Senator Schumer should be replaced. Whether Schumer deserves removal for failing to keep his caucus unified is debatable. It's rather difficult to prevent the surrender of those eager to raise the white flag. But Khanna's larger point stands. The Democratic Party's leadership has demonstrated once again that it lacks either the strategic acumen or the intestinal fortitude to wage effective political warfare. What makes this capitulation particularly galling is its utter predictability. Many leading Democrats argued their party's big wins in elections in New Jersey, Virginia, and New York City were attributable to the effective way their candidates lacerated Trump over the cost of living. Now, at the first chance they got to put that lesson into practice, fighting for the affordability of health care, they gave up. They learned the lesson, they saw it validated at the ballot box, and then they promptly forgot it when it came time to apply that knowledge. The 8 senators who voted for this travesty will doubtless face primary challenges, and one can only hope they succeed. Politics is not supposed to be easy, and standing up for principle occasionally requires accepting discomfort. If these senators were unwilling to endure a 40-day shutdown in defense of healthcare for millions, one wonders what they would be willing to fight for. Their own salaries, presumably. Perhaps their parking spaces. What we have witnessed here is cowardice dressed up in the language of political necessity. Sanders warned that the legislation paves the way for 15 million people to be thrown off Medicaid, and that studies show this will mean some 50,000 Americans will die every year unnecessarily. These are the stakes, and these 8 senators decided that a vague promise of a future vote was sufficient compensation for gambling with tens of thousands of lives. The historical record will show that when the moment arrived to stand firm on a matter of genuine moral importance, these senators blinked. In doing so, they have once again demonstrated why the Democratic Party so often fails to capitalize on its advantages, because when the moment arrives to actually fight, too many of its members would rather negotiate the terms of their own surrender. One can only hope that the American people, and particularly those 20 million who will soon be facing doubled insurance premiums, remember who abandoned them when the votes that matter come around.